A 7-year-old boy steals a billionaire CEO's wallet at a luxury mall, only to be caught by security. But when the billionaire asks him why he did it, the answer leaves him completely speechless. Before we begin, let us know in the comments where you're watching us from, and please like this video to support the channel. Now sit back, relax, and enjoy the story. The warm glow of designer displays casts long reflections on the polished marble floors of the high-end mall, the quiet hum of classical music blending seamlessly with the low chatter of wealthy shoppers. Patrick Langford barely glanced at the newest collection of watches displayed in a sleek glass case, his mind elsewhere as he checked his phone. A string of messages from his executive assistant awaited his attention, but he dismissed them for now. Work could wait. He had only stepped in to kill time before his next meeting. He adjusted the cuff of his tailored suit, shifting his stance slightly, unaware of the small figure lurking behind him. Jamie had been watching him for the past 10 minutes, studying the way the man carried himself, how easily he pulled a sleek black wallet from his pocket to check something before slipping it back. It was effortless, thoughtless, even. Like money meant nothing. Jamie's heart pounded as he edged closer. He had done this before, but never in a place like this, never with someone so powerful looking. But he didn't have a choice. His sister needed food, medicine, warmth. And the man in the expensive suit wouldn't even miss a few bills. Taking a shaky breath, Jamie moved quickly, his small fingers slipping into the billionaire's pocket with the precision of someone who had learned the hard way. He felt the cool leather of the wallet in his hand, his pulse hammering in his ears. Before Patrick could even notice the slight shift in weight, Jamie spun on his heel and darted away, weaving through the crowd with practiced speed. Patrick barely registered the movement at first. He felt a slight brush against his side, nothing alarming. But then a voice cut through the air, a sharp command. "Hey! Stop that kid!" Security reacted immediately. A towering guard near the entrance spotted Jamie and moved fast, intercepting him before he could disappear. A firm grip on his arm yanked him back, nearly making him trip over his own feet. The wallet tumbled from his grasp, skidding across the marble floor. A second later, Patrick stepped forward, irritation flashing across his face as he took in the sight before him, a small, scrappy boy with dirt-smudged cheeks and clothes 2 sizes too big. For a moment, no one spoke. The boy didn't struggle, didn't cry, didn't even look scared. His shoulders sagged, his expression eerily blank for someone so young. Patrick had seen plenty of thieves before, conniving businessmen, competitors trying to outmaneuver him, people who played dirty to get ahead. But this was different. He crouched down slightly, leveling his gaze with the boy's. "You stole from me," he said, his voice even. "Why?" The boy finally looked up. His eyes were striking, a deep shade of brown, but it wasn't their color that held Patrick's attention, it was the emptiness behind them, a kind of quiet suffering that didn't belong on a child's face. Jamie hesitated, as if debating whether or not to answer. Then, in a voice so small it was almost swallowed by the space between them, he said, "I just needed a little money, my sister is sick, and I don't know what else to do." The words hit Patrick harder than they should have. He wasn't sure why. Maybe it was the sheer simplicity of them. Maybe it was the way the boy didn't try to justify or beg for mercy. He just stated the truth, plain and unembellished. Patrick felt something shift inside him, but he quickly pushed it down, straightening as he gestured for security to release the kid. The guard hesitated. "You sure, Mr. Langford? We should call the police." "No," Patrick said firmly, his eyes still on Jamie. "I'll handle it." The guard let go, and Jamie rubbed his wrist absent-mindedly, his expression unreadable. He still didn't try to run. If anything, he seemed more resigned than before, as if he had already accepted whatever punishment was coming. Patrick bent down and picked up his wallet, flipping it open to check the contents. Nothing was missing. Not a single bill. "You weren't even going to take the money, were you?" Patrick asked, more to himself than to the boy. Jamie didn't answer. Patrick exhaled slowly, rubbing his temple. "What's your name?" Jamie hesitated again, then muttered, Jamie. And your sister? Lillian. Patrick studied him. The boy was rail-thin, his cheeks hollow, his hands chapped from the cold. His clothes were worn but clean, someone had tried to keep them in decent shape. His mother, maybe? Did he even have one? The situation should have been simple. Patrick should have walked away, let mall security deal with it, continued on with his day like this never happened. But something about the boy lingered in his mind, an unshakable sense that there was more to this than a simple act of theft. A long silence stretched between them before Patrick finally sighed. "Come with me," he said. Jamie tensed, his posture stiffening. "Are you turning me in?" Patrick studied him, then shook his head. "No. I just want to talk." Jamie didn't move at first, wary and untrusting. Then, with a barely perceptible nod, he followed Patrick out of the store, the billionaire's wallet still clutched tightly in his hand. Patrick led Jamie through the mall without a word, his long strides measured, the boy trailing slightly behind him. The guards exchanged looks as he passed, clearly confused about why their boss was taking personal interest in a petty thief. But no one questioned him. The entire situation was strange. Patrick had no reason to waste his time on this kid. He could have let security handle it, filed a report, walked away. Yet here he was, leading a dirty, ragged 7-year-old out of the pristine luxury wing as if he had any obligation to help. He told himself it was curiosity. That was all. The private elevator opened, and they stepped inside. Jamie shrank into the corner, keeping his hands stuffed deep into his pockets. The silence stretched between them until the doors slid open again, revealing the sleek, modern interior of Patrick's office on the top floor of the mall's corporate wing. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city, the glass reflecting the boy's small frame as he hesitantly stepped forward. His eyes darted around, taking in the leather furniture, the neatly stacked papers on Patrick's desk, the sharp angles of wealth and power that clearly belonged to a world he didn't fit into. Patrick leaned against his desk, arms crossed, studying the boy. "Sit," he said finally, nodding toward the chair across from him. Jamie hesitated, as if expecting a trick, before perching on the very edge, his body rigid with tension. "What's your last name?" Patrick asked. Jamie shook his head. "I can't tell you. Where do you live?" No answer. Patrick exhaled sharply, watching the boy's fingers curl into fists in his lap. "You're not making this easy. You could have just let security deal with me," Jamie said quietly, barely above a whisper. Patrick didn't have an answer for that. Instead, his gaze fell to Jamie's sleeves. The cuffs of his oversized jacket had slid up slightly, revealing dark bruises along his thin wrists. His knuckles were scraped raw, his hands dry and cracked from exposure. The jacket itself was an afterthought against the biting winter air outside, far too thin for the cold. Patrick wasn't a compassionate man. He didn't get sentimental over strangers. He had spent years clawing his way to the top, building a life where emotions were liabilities, where weakness meant failure. But something about the boy's quiet resolve, the way he held himself together despite everything, gnawed at him in a way he couldn't ignore. Against his better judgment, he reached for the intercom. "Tell the kitchen to bring up some food," he said to his assistant before clicking it off. Jamie's head snapped up. "I don't need to eat first," Patrick cut him off. "Then we talk." Jamie's mouth tightened, but he didn't argue. A few minutes later, a steaming plate of food arrived, simple, but more than enough for someone his size. Jamie hesitated, his eyes flickering between Patrick and the plate, as if waiting for permission. Patrick nodded toward it. "Go ahead." Jamie reached out cautiously, then, as if his control snapped all at once, he started eating fast, too fast, shoving bites into his mouth like the plate might be taken from him at any moment. Patrick watched in silence. The way the kid devoured his food made it clear this wasn't just hunger. This was desperation. "Slow down," Patrick said after a moment. "No one's taking it from you." Jamie swallowed hard, nodding slightly but barely slowing his pace. He only stopped when he had scraped the plate clean, leaning back slightly, his breathing uneven. How long has it been since you last ate? Patrick asked. Jamie looked down. I dunno. A while. The response came out so casually, so matter-of-fact, that it made Patrick's stomach tighten. This kid wasn't just struggling. He was surviving. Jamie hesitated before speaking again, his voice barely audible. Please, sir. I'll pay you back one day, I swear. Patrick exhaled, rubbing his temple. There was no part of his life that involved charity. He had built everything he had from nothing, refusing handouts, refusing pity. He had never believed in giving anything for free. The world didn't work that way. But something about this boy was different. Something about the way he had stolen not for greed, but for someone else, made Patrick pause in a way he never had before. You think I need your money? He asked, his voice edged with amusement. Jamie's cheeks flushed slightly. I don't want to owe you anything. Patrick stared at him for a long moment, trying to make sense of why he was still sitting here, why he hadn't just handed the kid over to the authorities and walked away. He didn't know why this one mattered. But he wasn't brushing it off, not yet. Patrick leaned back in his chair, watching as Jamie shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The boy had fallen silent after his last words, arms crossed over his chest like he was bracing himself for whatever came next. Patrick exhaled, rubbing his temple, feeling an odd tension in his chest. He still didn't know why he was entertaining any of this. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the strange way Jamie carried himself, tough, determined, but underneath it all, something else. A kind of quiet pain that didn't belong on a child's face. He reached for his wallet, flipping it open out of habit. At first, he barely glanced at the contents, his credit cards, business ID, a few neatly folded bills, but then, something caught his eye. Tucked between the sleek leather folds was a small, crumpled photograph. His fingers hesitated as he pulled it free, the edges worn, the ink slightly faded. He frowned. This wasn't his. Unfolding it carefully, he felt the breath leave his lungs. The image staring back at him was an old one, but he would have recognized the face anywhere. A young woman, her dark hair loose around her shoulders, smiling softly at the camera. In her arms, wrapped in a pale blue blanket, was a newborn baby. Patrick's grip on the photo tightened as a rush of memories slammed into him all at once. Hannah. It had been years since he had last seen her, since he had walked away without looking back. He had convinced himself it was for the best. He had been young, ambitious, unwilling to let anything tie him down. And now, staring at the photograph, something inside him twisted in a way he wasn't prepared for. His gaze snapped to Jamie. Where did you get this? Jamie didn't answer right away. His small fingers curled into the fabric of his oversized jacket, his posture suddenly more guarded. Jamie. Patrick's voice was sharper now, edged with something unreadable. Where did you get this picture? Jamie hesitated, his lips pressing into a thin line before he finally spoke. That's my mom, he said quietly. She told me to find you if I ever needed help. For a moment, the words didn't quite register. Patrick stared at him, feeling as though the floor had shifted beneath him. He looked at the boy again, really looked at him. The dark eyes, the sharp features. And suddenly, it wasn't so hard to see her in him. His fingers tightened around the photo as his mind raced. This wasn't possible. He would have known. Hannah would have told him. Wouldn't she? His voice came out rougher than he intended. Your mom's name? Jamie's brows furrowed slightly, as if suspicious of the question. Hannah, he said. Patrick's chest constricted. His silence must have unsettled Jamie because the boy's shoulders tensed. She said you wouldn't care, he murmured, almost to himself. She said I shouldn't bother. Patrick swallowed hard, his throat suddenly dry. Why did she send you to me? Jamie glanced down, his fingers tightening around the edge of his jacket. She didn't, he admitted. She just told me your name once. I remembered. His voice grew even quieter. She's gone. Patrick's breath hitched. The words cut through the air like a blade, sharp and unforgiving. Gone. Hannah was dead. A strange pressure settled in his chest, something heavy and unfamiliar. He didn't know what he had been expecting, certainly not this. He had walked away from her all those years ago thinking they had both moved on, that their lives had taken separate paths, clean and uncomplicated. He had never imagined she had been carrying something so much heavier. He had never imagined she had been carrying his child. The realization sank into his bones with a weight that nearly knocked the breath out of him. Jamie fidgeted under his gaze. "I wasn't gonna tell you," he admitted, voice barely above a whisper. "I just needed help for my sister. That's all." Patrick forced himself to focus, even as his mind reeled. His fingers curled around the photograph. "Your sister?" "Lillian," Jamie said, glancing up at him warily. "She's sick. That's why. Why I took your wallet. I wasn't gonna steal everything, I swear. I just needed a little to get her medicine." Patrick's grip on the photo loosened slightly. There was something about the way Jamie said it, so simple, so resigned, that made something twist deep in his gut. He wasn't sure what to say, how to respond. What was he supposed to do? His instincts told him to distance himself. This wasn't his problem. He didn't know this kid. But another part of him, the part that couldn't shake the ghost of Hannah's smile from the photograph, refused to let it go so easily. He exhaled, rubbing a hand over his jaw. "Where is she?" Jamie stiffened slightly. "I'm not telling you." Patrick narrowed his eyes. "Why not?" Jamie's jaw clenched, and for the first time since their conversation started, there was real defiance in his gaze. "Because I don't trust you." Patrick stared at him. The words shouldn't have stung. But somehow they did. Patrick's gaze remained fixed on the boy, his mind struggling to process the weight of what had just been revealed. The photograph still rested between his fingers, but it felt heavier now, like it carried all the years he had walked away from without looking back. Hannah. The past he had buried, the choices he had convinced himself were necessary, all coming back to life in the form of this small, defiant child sitting across from him. His child. Jamie watched him with cautious eyes, his thin frame tense as if he expected Patrick to lash out, to demand he leave. But Patrick didn't say anything right away. He didn't even know where to start. Finally, he exhaled sharply. "How long have you been on your own?" Jamie hesitated, his fingers tightening into the fabric of his jacket before he answered. "Since Mom died. It's been a few months." His voice was steady, but there was an unmistakable tightness to it, the kind that came from holding back too much for too long. Patrick clenched his jaw. "And your father?" "Before me, I mean." Jamie's eyes flickered with something unreadable. "Never had one," he said simply. Patrick swallowed hard. He had spent years believing his past with Hannah had been just that, past. A chapter closed, a decision made. He had convinced himself that leaving had been best for both of them. He had been young, hungry for success, unwilling to be tied down. He had told himself she would move on, that she would find someone who wanted the life he had rejected. But she never had. He forced his voice to stay even. "And Lillian?" Jamie's shoulders squared slightly, protective. "She's 4, he said. She's sick. She has a heart condition. The doctors said she needs surgery, but we don't have any money. We barely had anything even before we got evicted." Patrick's stomach tightened. "Evicted?" Jamie nodded stiffly. "Yeah. Mom tried to keep up with rent even when she got sick, but after she was gone, I couldn't. The landlord kicked us out, and I didn't know where else to go. We stayed in shelters when we could, but..." He hesitated, as if he didn't want to admit the rest. "They separate you sometimes. Families. I couldn't let them take Lillian away." Patrick's grip on the photograph tightened. "So where are you staying now?" Jamie looked away, jaw set. "Nowhere." "Jamie." A long pause. Then, finally, Jamie muttered, "An old storage unit." Patrick inhaled sharply. The idea of a child, his child, living in a storage unit, taking care of a sick little sister with nothing but whatever scraps he could find, made something deep in his chest twist painfully. "You've been living in a storage unit," Patrick repeated, the words coming out slower, as if saying them aloud made them harder to believe. Jamie lifted his chin slightly, as if daring Patrick to judge him. "It's warm enough," he said. "I keep Lillian wrapped up good at night. And I work when I can. Sometimes people pay me to carry groceries, clean their cars. It's not a lot, but it's enough to keep us fed. Mostly." His voice wavered just slightly on the last word, and he swallowed hard, looking away again. Patrick didn't speak right away. He didn't know how to. The boy sitting in front of him, his son, had been surviving on his own for months, struggling to keep himself and his little sister alive while he, Patrick Langford, one of the wealthiest men in the city, had been sitting in luxury, completely unaware. His fingers pressed against his temple, tension coiling inside him. "Why didn't you ask for help?" Jamie let out a humorless laugh. "From who?" he asked. "We don't have anyone. No family, no friends. Mom didn't talk about her past much, but I knew she had nobody left. She worked so hard, but when she got sick, she didn't want people feeling sorry for her. And by the time she was gone, I didn't know what else to do." His voice had softened now, like he was finally admitting something he hadn't let himself say before. Patrick forced himself to stay composed, but it wasn't easy. "And she told you about me?" Jamie nodded. "Once. A long time ago. I don't even think she meant to, really. I was little, and I asked her why we didn't have a dad. She just said you weren't part of the picture and never would be. That you had your own life. That I shouldn't bother." He exhaled slowly. "She wasn't angry, not really. She just didn't expect anything from you." Patrick closed his eyes briefly, feeling a wave of something thick and suffocating settle over him. Guilt. Jamie shifted in his seat. "I wasn't gonna find you," he admitted. "Not at first. I figured she was right. But Lillian, she's getting worse. The medicine isn't working anymore, and I heard someone say she won't last if she doesn't get the surgery soon. So I thought maybe, just maybe, you'd care enough to help. Even if it's just for her." Patrick exhaled slowly, trying to ground himself in the present, but it was difficult. He had spent years believing that his past choices were just that, past. That what he had done, or failed to do, had no lingering consequences. But now, sitting across from this boy, hearing how he had been fighting to survive, how his little sister might not have much time left, made all of those beliefs shatter at once. He had walked away from Hannah, thinking she would be fine. But she had struggled. She had been alone. And now she was gone. And in her absence, her children, his children, were left to fend for themselves in a world that had given them nothing. Patrick swallowed hard, his voice quieter when he finally spoke again. "What if I told you I wanted to help?" Jamie's eyes narrowed slightly, his posture stiffening. "I'd say you're probably lying." Patrick let out a humorless breath. "Fair enough." Jamie studied him for a long moment before finally shaking his head. "It doesn't matter. I didn't come here for you. I came here for Lillian. If you can help her then that's enough." Patrick nodded slowly, but he knew deep down it wasn't enough. Not for him. Not anymore. Patrick sat in silence, his fingers still gripping the edges of the worn photograph, his thoughts tangled in a storm of disbelief and guilt. Jamie sat across from him, his expression unreadable, but there was something almost defiant in the way he held himself, as if he had already decided that Patrick would walk away, just like his mother had always predicted. And maybe that should have been the easier choice. Maybe Patrick should have written a check, called the hospital, and let them handle it. That was how he solved problems in his world, with money, with efficiency, without getting personally involved. But this wasn't just a problem to solve. This was a life. 2 lives. And no matter how much he wanted to tell himself otherwise, he couldn't ignore the ache in his chest when he looked at Jamie, when he heard the way the boy had spoken about his mother, about his sister. He wanted to believe this was a mistake, that Hannah would have told him if she had been pregnant, that he would have had a choice. But none of that changed the reality in front of him. Still, he needed proof. "I'll help your sister," Patrick said finally, his voice measured. "But first, we're doing a DNA test." Jamie's expression didn't change. If anything, his eyes darkened slightly, the tiniest flicker of something like hurt crossing his face before he quickly masked it. "You don't believe me," he said flatly. Patrick didn't answer immediately. He wasn't sure how to. "I just need to be sure," he said, though even as the words left his mouth, they felt hollow. He had already seen the truth. He had seen it in Jamie's face, in the sharp angles of his jaw, in the unmistakable look in his eyes, Hannah's eyes. But years of logic, of learning not to trust anything without proof, kept him from admitting it outright. Jamie didn't argue. He just nodded stiffly. "Fine," he muttered. Patrick exhaled, pressing his fingers to his temple. "Where's Lillian?" Jamie hesitated, his posture stiffening again, but after a long moment, he muttered, "I'll show you." The ride was silent. Jamie sat in the passenger seat, his small hands curled into fists in his lap, his body angled slightly toward the door, as if ready to bolt at any moment. Patrick drove without speaking, his mind racing. He had given his assistant instructions to arrange the DNA test as soon as possible, but even as he told himself he needed the confirmation, he knew, deep down, that it wouldn't change anything. When they pulled up to the rundown storage facility on the outskirts of the city, Patrick felt something cold settle in his stomach. The lot was nearly empty, dimly lit by flickering overhead lamps. Rusted metal doors lined the narrow alleyway, their faded numbers barely visible. This wasn't a place for people to live. Jamie got out without a word, leading Patrick toward one of the units. He hesitated only briefly before unlocking the dented metal door and pushing it open. Patrick had braced himself for something bad. But nothing could have prepared him for the sight in front of him. The space was small, barely large enough to fit an old mattress on the floor, covered in mismatched blankets. A few scattered belongings were tucked into the corners, plastic bags filled with whatever clothes they had, a single bottle of water, an empty can of soup. And in the middle of it all, curled up beneath the thin blankets, was a little girl. She was tiny. Too tiny. Her dark hair was damp against her forehead, her breaths uneven, labored. Even in sleep, her small fingers clutched the edge of the blanket as if holding onto it was the only thing keeping her grounded. Patrick felt something inside him crack. Jamie knelt beside her, brushing a hand gently over her forehead. She stirred slightly, blinking up at him with half-lidded eyes. "Jamie?" Her voice was barely more than a whisper. "I'm here," Jamie said softly. "You're okay." Lillian's gaze shifted, landing on Patrick. She studied him for a moment before blinking slowly. "Who's that?" Jamie hesitated before answering. "He's gonna help." Patrick couldn't move. He couldn't speak. For the first time in years, he felt truly, completely unprepared. This was real. This wasn't a hypothetical, wasn't a story in the news about kids suffering in some distant place. This was his reality now. His responsibility. He crouched down slowly, his voice quieter than he intended when he finally spoke. "Hey, sweetheart." Lillian just stared at him, too weak to react much, but something about the way she looked at him made his chest tighten. "She needs a hospital," Patrick said, his voice coming out sharper than he meant it to. Jamie's expression hardened instantly. "No," he said, shaking his head. "Jamie, no." The boy's fists clenched. "They'll separate us. They always do. And then I won't be able to make sure she's okay." Patrick exhaled, pinching the bridge of his nose. He didn't have time to argue. "Fine," he said. "But she's coming with me. Both of you are." Jamie looked at him like he wasn't sure whether to believe him or not. Patrick met his gaze. "I don't care what you think about me. But I'm not leaving her here. And I'm not leaving you." Jamie's jaw tightened. But then, after a long pause, he nodded. Patrick didn't waste another second. He scooped Lillian up carefully, feeling how light she was, how fragile. She barely reacted, just rested her head against his shoulder, her tiny fingers curling slightly into the fabric of his suit. For the first time in years, Patrick remembered what it felt like to care about something beyond himself. And for the first time, he realized just how much he had lost by walking away all those years ago. He wasn't going to make that mistake again. Patrick carried Lillian out of the storage unit with careful, steady steps, but inside, he felt anything but calm. Her tiny body barely weighed anything in his arms, her breathing shallow and uneven. Jamie walked beside him, silent, his small hands balled into fists. He didn't protest when Patrick put Lillian in the car, didn't fight him like he had before. Maybe he finally realized the same thing Patrick did, there wasn't any time left to argue. The ride to the hospital was quiet, the only sound Lillian's faint breaths and the hum of the engine. Jamie sat in the back, eyes locked on his sister, his jaw tight. Patrick glanced at him in the mirror but said nothing. What was there to say? That he was sorry? That he should have been there years ago? That none of this should have happened? Words felt useless now. The moment they arrived, Patrick didn't wait for anyone. He strode into the hospital, cutting through the waiting area with Lillian in his arms, his voice sharp and commanding as he called for a doctor. The staff responded immediately, their demeanor shifting when they recognized him. Money didn't buy everything, but it did buy speed. Within minutes, Lillian was on a stretcher, rushed into an exam room, nurses moving swiftly around her, wires and monitors attaching to her small frame. Jamie tried to follow, but a nurse stopped him. You need to wait out here, she said gently. Jamie shook his head. No. She needs me. Patrick stepped in, placing a hand on Jamie's shoulder. Let them help her, he said, his voice softer than before. Jamie hesitated, then slowly nodded. The next few hours passed in a blur. Lillian was stabilized, but the news wasn't good. The doctors ran tests, spoke in hushed tones, their expressions tight. Patrick didn't like the way they looked at him, at Jamie, like they were preparing to deliver the worst kind of news. Then the DNA test results arrived. Patrick had expected them to confirm what he already knew, but seeing it in black and white made something shift in him. Jamie was his son. There was no denying it, no rationalizing it away. This boy, this tough, stubborn, too grown for his age boy, was his. And Lillian, whether the test proved it or not, was his responsibility too. He found Jamie pacing outside the hospital room, his small body tense, exhaustion clear in his face. He had barely spoken since they arrived, his arms wrapped around himself like he was holding everything in. Patrick swallowed hard. It's official, he said quietly. You're mine. Jamie didn't react at first. Then he let out a short, bitter laugh. Took you long enough to figure that out. Patrick exhaled, rubbing his temple. I should have known sooner. Yeah, Jamie said, voice flat. You should have. Patrick didn't argue. He had no defense. Before he could say more, a doctor approached. Patrick straightened immediately. How is she? The doctor hesitated, and that pause alone made Patrick's stomach drop. She's stable for now, the doctor said. But it's not good. Her heart is failing faster than we expected. The medication isn't enough anymore. Jamie stiffened beside him. What does that mean? The doctor's expression was grim. She needs a transplant. Immediately. The words landed like a blow. Patrick felt Jamie go rigid, saw the way his fingers clenched at his sides. We'll put her on the transplant list, Patrick said, already thinking of the calls he would make, the strings he would pull. How fast can we get her to the top? The doctor hesitated again. That's the problem. She's a rare match. Finding a donor in time. He shook his head. It's not impossible, but it's unlikely. Without a match, she won't survive. Jamie inhaled sharply, his breath shaking. Patrick didn't let himself hesitate. I'll find one, he said, his voice hard with determination. Whatever it takes. The doctor nodded, but his expression remained cautious. We'll do everything we can. When he walked away, silence stretched between Patrick and Jamie. "She's going to die, isn't she?" Jamie's voice was quiet, but there was something raw beneath it. Patrick's jaw tightened. "No." Jamie turned to him, eyes dark with something unreadable. "You don't know that." Patrick crouched down so they were eye level. "I will find her a heart. Do you hear me?" Jamie's throat bobbed, but he nodded. Patrick stood, already pulling out his phone. He wasn't going to lose this fight. Not this time. The calls started immediately. Patrick had power, influence, money. He would use all of it. He reached out to the best specialists, every contact he had in the medical world. He pushed, demanded, made sure Lillian's case was prioritized. But for every call he made, the answer remained the same. There was no donor. Days passed. Lillian remained stable, but just barely. Every time Patrick walked into her hospital room, she looked smaller, weaker. Jamie refused to leave her side, barely sleeping, barely eating. Patrick worked nonstop, but it wasn't enough. He could fix problems. He could control outcomes. But this was slipping through his fingers, and there wasn't a damn thing he could do to stop it. Then, on the 5th day, the doctor pulled him aside. "We're out of time," he said. "If we don't find a match in the next 48 hours, she won't make it." Patrick had spent his life making impossible things happen. He had built an empire from nothing, turned failures into success. But this wasn't business. This wasn't strategy. This was life and death, and for the first time, he didn't know if he could win. And losing meant losing Lillian forever. Patrick barely left the hospital. His penthouse, his office, his entire world outside these sterile white walls, none of it mattered anymore. Every waking moment was spent making calls, meeting with specialists, pulling every string he had to get Lillian the heart she needed. He had never begged for anything in his life, but now, he would have begged on his knees if it meant saving her. But no matter how much money he threw, no matter how many favors he called in, the answer remained the same. There was no match. He refused to believe it. There had to be someone. He scoured the country, expanded the search internationally. He offered incentives so large they made headlines, but it didn't matter. Lillian was slipping away, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Jamie stayed by her side every second. He barely spoke, barely acknowledged Patrick. He just sat there, watching her tiny chest rise and fall with unsteady breaths, his small hand wrapped around hers. Patrick had never seen a child carry so much weight on his shoulders. It was unbearable. Then one night, everything changed. Patrick had stepped out for just a moment. A doctor had requested to speak with him about alternative treatment options, not a solution, just ways to make Lillian comfortable. The words hit him like a knife to the gut, but he listened because he had no choice. When he finally returned to Lillian's room, his heart stopped. Jamie was gone. Panic surged through him like ice water. He spun, scanning the hallway, checking the bathroom, the waiting area. Nothing. His stomach twisted as he grabbed the nearest nurse. "Where's Jamie?" She blinked, startled. I don't know. He was here just a moment ago." Patrick's pulse thundered in his ears. He didn't waste another second. He tore through the hospital, searching every hallway, every empty room. Security was alerted, but he didn't wait for them. He needed to find his son now. He found him in the transplant ward. Jamie sat in a chair, his small frame hunched over, his shoulders shaking. A doctor stood in front of him, looking shocked, while another nurse kneeled beside him, speaking softly. Patrick didn't hear the words at first. He only heard Jamie. "I told them to take my heart instead," Jamie whispered. His voice was small, broken. "I don't need it as much as she does." Patrick felt the breath leave his lungs. For a moment, he couldn't move, couldn't think. He had spent his entire life calculating risk, making decisions that shaped industries, empires. But he had never felt as helpless as he did in that moment. He stepped forward, his voice hoarse. "Jamie." Jamie lifted his head, his face streaked with silent tears. They said no, he choked out, as if he still didn't understand why. They said I can't do it. Patrick dropped to his knees in front of him, hands gripping Jamie's shoulders. Of course they said no, he rasped. Because that's not how this works. Because you don't get to do this. Jamie shook his head, his whole body trembling. I just want her to be okay. Patrick felt something deep inside him shatter. This boy, his son, was willing to give up everything for his sister. A child who had spent his life fighting to survive was willing to lay it down without a second thought. Patrick pulled him into his arms, holding him tightly as Jamie's small hands clutched his shirt. I know, Patrick murmured. I know you do. But you don't get to die for her. You hear me? You don't get to die. Jamie didn't respond. He just buried his face in Patrick's shoulder and sobbed. Patrick held him, his grip firm, grounding, as if he could physically keep him tethered to this world. For the first time since this nightmare began, he let himself feel everything, the fear, the helplessness, the unbearable weight of knowing he might lose one of them. He had spent so many years building walls around himself, convincing himself that caring too much was a weakness. But nothing in his life had ever mattered more than the boy in his arms and the little girl fighting for her life down the hall. Then, just as all hope seemed lost, Patrick's phone rang. He almost didn't answer. His hands were still wrapped around Jamie, his mind still reeling. But something told him to pick up. He did. And everything changed. The voice on the other end was rushed, urgent. Mr. Langford, we found a match. Patrick froze. Say that again. A donor match. It just came through. The heart is en route now. Patrick's grip on Jamie tightened. His throat felt thick, his vision blurred at the edges. Are you sure? Positive. We're prepping her for surgery now. Patrick inhaled sharply, then exhaled just as hard. Relief hit him like a tidal wave, but it was mixed with something else, something darker. A donor meant a loss. Somewhere, someone had just died, and because of that, Lillian would live. But he couldn't think about that now. He pulled back slightly, cupping Jamie's face with both hands. Lillian's getting a heart, he said, his voice rough. They found a match. Jamie's breath hitched. She's gonna be okay? Patrick nodded. She's gonna be okay. Jamie let out a choke sound, half sob, half breathless relief. Then he collapsed against Patrick again, his arms wrapping around him as if he was afraid to let go. Patrick held him tighter. He wasn't going anywhere. Not now. Not ever. Patrick sat in the cold, sterile waiting room, his hands clasped tightly together, fingers interlocked as if that alone would keep him from unraveling. He had faced high-stakes boardroom deals, billion-dollar mergers, and cutthroat negotiations that could make or break empires, but nothing had ever made him feel as powerless as this. Hours passed in agonizing silence. Jamie sat beside him, curled up in the chair, his arms wrapped around his knees, his eyes never leaving the doors that led to the operating room. Either of them spoke. There was nothing left to say, only waiting. When the doors finally opened, Patrick shot to his feet so fast his chair nearly tipped over. The surgeon approached with an expression so carefully neutral it sent a fresh wave of dread through him. Jamie stiffened beside him, his small hands clenched into fists. Patrick braced himself for the worst. She made it, the doctor said. For the first time in his life, Patrick's legs nearly gave out beneath him. Jamie let out a sound, somewhere between a sob and a laugh, as relief crashed over them like a tidal wave. The boy turned to Patrick as if needing confirmation, as if afraid he had misheard. Patrick nodded, exhaling a shaky breath. She made it, he repeated, and the words tasted like a miracle. The next few days were a blur. Lillian was moved to the ICU, her small body connected to monitors and 4 lines, but she was alive. That was all that mattered. Patrick stayed by her side, unwilling to leave even for a second. He barely slept, barely ate. The only time he stepped out was when Jamie dragged him away long enough to get some air, both of them equally exhausted from the weight of it all. Then, one evening, after what felt like a lifetime, Lily Ann's eyes fluttered open. Jamie was the first to notice. He bolted upright from where he had been dozing off, nearly knocking over the chair he had been curled up in. "Lily Ann?" His voice cracked, filled with hope and fear all at once. Her small fingers twitched against the blanket, her lips parting as if trying to form words. Then, in the softest, sleepiest voice, she murmured, "Jamie?" Jamie let out a choked sound, scrambling to her bedside. "You're awake," he whispered, his hands shaking as he reached for her. Patrick stood frozen for a moment, his throat tightening, his vision blurring at the edges. Then he stepped forward, placing a steady hand on Jamie's shoulder. "Hey, sweetheart," he said softly. Lily Ann blinked up at him, confusion flickering across her pale features. "Are you the man from before?" Patrick's chest constricted. Jamie looked between them, then turned to his sister. "Yeah. That's our dad." The words hit Patrick like a punch to the gut. Not because they were shocking, but because of how natural they sounded coming from Jamie. He had fought him at every turn, had refused to trust him, had expected Patrick to walk away. But now, for the first time, Jamie was acknowledging the truth either of them had wanted to face. Lily Ann's lips curved into a sleepy smile. "Oh, that's nice." Patrick let out a breath that felt like it had been trapped inside him for years. The recovery was slow, but every day, Lily Ann grew stronger. Jamie rarely left her side, and neither did Patrick. For the first time in his life, he wasn't rushing back to meetings, wasn't checking his phone for stock updates or emails. His entire world had narrowed down to the tiny hospital room and the two children who had changed his life in ways he hadn't even realized he needed. When the time finally came for Lily Ann to be discharged, Patrick had already made his decision. Jamie was wary when Patrick sat him down outside the hospital, his small hands shoved into the pockets of his hoodie, his eyes filled with that same guarded expression he had carried since the day they met. "You don't have to keep us, you know," Jamie said before Patrick could even speak. His voice was quiet, but the words hit like a sledgehammer. Patrick's jaw tightened. "Jamie, I get it," Jamie interrupted. "You helped Lily Ann. You did more than anyone else ever would. And I'm grateful. Really. But you don't have to pretend like you want us." Patrick inhaled sharply, running a hand over his face. How could this kid not see it? How could he still think, after everything, that Patrick would just let them go? "I'm not pretending," Patrick said firmly. Jamie looked up at him, skeptical. "Then what are you saying?" Patrick exhaled, his voice softer now. "I'm saying I want you both to come home with me." Jamie flinched, as if the words physically hit him. His throat bobbed, and for the first time, Patrick saw real fear in his eyes, not fear of being hurt, but fear of believing in something too good to be true. "Forever?" Jamie's voice was barely above a whisper. "Forever," Patrick confirmed. "I'm not going anywhere." Jamie stared at him, his expression warring between disbelief and hope. Then, suddenly, his tough exterior cracked. His face crumpled, and before Patrick could react, Jamie lunged forward, throwing his arms around him in a fierce, desperate hug. Patrick froze for half a second before wrapping his arms around the boy, holding him just as tightly. Jamie buried his face in Patrick's chest, his small body shaking as years of fear, loneliness, and exhaustion finally broke free. Patrick pressed a hand to the back of Jamie's head, his throat tight. "You're mine, Jamie," he murmured. "You always were." The adoption papers were finalized within weeks. The legal process was a formality. Patrick had already made up his mind long before signing the documents. Jamie and Lily Ann were his, and nothing would change that. But Patrick wasn't done. He had spent his entire life building a name for himself in business, in wealth, in power. Now, for the first time, he wanted to build something else. The Hannah Langford Foundation launched 6 months later, dedicated to helping struggling families, single parents, and children who had nowhere else to turn. It was a small way to honor the woman he had lost and the family he had nearly missed out on. One evening, As they sat together in their new home, Lillian curled up in Patrick's lap while Jamie sat beside him on the couch, flipping through a book. Jamie shifted, tugging on Patrick's sleeve. "Are we really a family now?" Patrick looked at him, at the boy who had once been a stranger, at the son he hadn't known he had. Then he reached out, pulling Jamie into his arms alongside Lillian. "We always were," he said quietly. "I just didn't know it yet." The house was quiet except for the soft hum of the fireplace, its golden light casting long, flickering shadows across the living room. The scent of fresh-baked cookies still lingered in the air from earlier, when Lillian had insisted on making a mess in the kitchen with the new nanny, her small hands covered in flour, her laughter echoing through the halls. Now she was asleep on Patrick's chest, her tiny body rising and falling with deep, steady breaths. The warmth of her, the weight of her trust, settled something deep in his chest, something he hadn't even realized had been missing for years. Jamie sat beside him, curled up with a book, pretending to read but stealing glances at Patrick every so often. It had become a habit of his, watching, waiting, as if some part of him still feared this wasn't real, that it could all disappear in an instant. But Patrick wasn't going anywhere. Not now. Not ever. It had been months since the adoption was finalized, since their lives had shifted from survival to something softer, something stable. Lillian had grown stronger each day, her cheeks no longer hollow, her once frail frame now filled out with the energy of a child who had been given a second chance. She still had doctor's visits, medications to take, precautions to follow, but she was alive. And Patrick would make sure she stayed that way. Jamie, on the other hand, was more of a slow burn. He didn't trust easily, didn't believe in fairy tales. Even now, with his own bedroom, more food than he knew what to do with, and a father who had given him a last name he never expected to carry, there were moments where the wariness crept back in. When he flinched at loud voices, when he hesitated before reaching for something he wanted, as if afraid it would be taken away. Patrick knew it would take time, and he had all the time in the world to give. He reached out, ruffling Jamie's hair lightly, watching as the boy wrinkled his nose but didn't pull away. That, in itself, was a victory. "You're staring," Jamie muttered, flipping a page in his book, pretending not to notice. Patrick smirked. "Maybe." Jamie sighed, setting the book down on his lap. He fidgeted for a moment before glancing up, his expression unreadable. "You really meant it, didn't you?" Patrick tilted his head slightly. "Meant what?" Jamie hesitated. "That we're staying. That you're keeping us. That this is real." Patrick's heart clenched. He hadn't realized Jamie still doubted it, still thought this might be temporary. He shifted, carefully adjusting Lillian without waking her before turning his full attention to Jamie. "Look around you," Patrick said softly. "This is your home now. It always will be." Jamie chewed on his lip, his fingers tightening around the fabric of his sweater. "I don't know what that's supposed to feel like," he admitted quietly. Patrick swallowed against the ache in his throat. This boy had spent his entire life taking care of others, never letting himself need anything, never allowing himself to believe in something as simple as a home. He had been forced to grow up too fast, to become something no child should ever have to be, self-sufficient, independent, hardened. Patrick reached over, placing a firm hand on Jamie's shoulder. "Then we'll figure it out together," he promised. Jamie studied him for a long moment before nodding, just once. It wasn't a grand declaration, wasn't a dramatic moment of realization, but it was something. And for Jamie, that was everything. Patrick exhaled, leaning back against the couch. "Besides," he added, smirking slightly, "you're already acting like a teenager. Might as well make it official before you start slamming doors and telling me I don't understand you." Jamie rolled his eyes. "I already do that." Patrick chuckled. "Yeah, I've noticed." The warmth between them settled, filling the space that had once been nothing but empty silence. A soft murmur came from Patrick's chest, and he looked down to see Lillian stirring, her tiny hands stretching as she blinked up at him sleepily. "Did I fall asleep?" she asked, voice thick with drowsiness. You did, Patrick murmured, brushing a strand of hair from her face. Long day. Lillian gave a sleepy little nod before snuggling closer, her breath warm against his shirt. I like it here, she whispered. Patrick felt something deep in his chest, something that had been locked away for too long, crack open. He pressed a kiss to the top of her head. I like it too, he admitted. Jamie let out a dramatic sigh. You guys are so emotional. Patrick smirked. Don't act like you don't love it. Jamie huffed, but his lips twitched slightly. Maybe a little. Patrick pulled both of them closer, his arms wrapped securely around the two children who had changed everything. The ruthless businessman he had been before felt like a stranger, like someone he barely recognized. For years he had thought success was measured in wealth, in power, in control. But now, sitting in a quiet living room with a sleeping daughter in his arms and a son who was finally starting to believe in forever, he knew the truth. This was success. This was everything. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months. The chill of winter faded into the warmth of spring, and for the first time in his life, Patrick found himself marking time not by business deals and stock markets, but by soccer practices, bedtime stories, and the sound of laughter filling the once empty halls of his house. He hadn't realized how quiet his world had been until Jamie and Lillian had come crashing into it. It wasn't always easy. Jamie was still Jamie, stubborn, independent, too old for his years. He still flinched sometimes when someone raised their voice, still hesitated before asking for things, still had nights where he woke up from dreams he never talked about. And Lillian, despite her rapid recovery, still had doctor's visits and medications, reminders of how fragile life had once been. But they were healing. Together. One evening, after a long day, Patrick found Jamie sitting on the front steps, staring at the sky. He had grown taller, his shoulders broader, but there was still something about him that reminded Patrick of the boy he had met that day in the mall, too small for the weight he carried. Patrick sat down beside him, resting his elbows on his knees. You planning on running away again? Jamie snorted. Nah. I figured you'd just come find me. Patrick chuckled, but he didn't miss the truth in those words. Jamie had spent so long expecting people to leave. Now, he knew Patrick wouldn't. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching as the stars blinked into existence one by one. I used to sit outside like this with Lillian, Jamie said eventually. His voice was quiet, almost distant. Back when we were still in the storage unit. She was scared of the dark, so I'd tell her stories, point at the stars and make up constellations. Patrick swallowed past the lump in his throat. He couldn't change the past. He couldn't erase the years of struggle Jamie had endured. But he could make damn sure the boy never had to do it alone again. You know, Patrick said, you could be anything you want to be. A scientist, an astronaut. Someone who actually gets to see those stars up close. Jamie shrugged. I don't know what I want to be yet. That's okay, Patrick said. You've got time to figure it out. Jamie tilted his head, studying him. You really think that? I do. Jamie was quiet for a moment, then he took a breath, as if steeling himself for something. I don't want to just be some rich guy's adopted kid, he admitted. I want to be something. I want to help people. Patrick smiled. You already do. Jamie looked at him, skeptical. How? Patrick reached over, ruffling his hair. You saved your sister. You walked into a world you knew nothing about just to find help for her. You're already more of a man than half the people I work with. Jamie wrinkled his nose. That's a low bar. Patrick laughed. Fair enough. Jamie was quiet for a while, his gaze back on the sky. Then, almost hesitantly, he asked, Do you think Mom would be proud of me? Patrick's chest tightened. He didn't have to ask who Jamie meant. He had thought about Hannah a lot over the past few months, what she had gone through, how she had raised 2 kids alone, how she had never once reached out to him, whether out of pride or because she had simply stopped believing he would care. He would never get the chance to ask her. He would never be able to tell her that he was sorry. But there was one thing he knew without a doubt. She would be, Patrick said, his voice steady. More than you'll ever know. Jamie didn't respond, but something in his posture softened. Patrick rested a hand on the boy's shoulder. Come on. It's late. They stood together, walking back inside, where Lillian was curled up on the couch, already asleep. Patrick watched them both, and for the first time in years he felt whole. Jamie hesitated before heading upstairs, glancing back at him. Night, Dad. Patrick stilled. It wasn't the first time Jamie had called him that, but every time he did, it hit Patrick like a revelation. Good night, son. The words felt right. Like they had always been meant to be. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to leave a like, it really helps out the channel. And if you want more heartwarming and emotional stories like this, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Let me know in the comments what you thought of this one. I'd love to hear your reactions. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.